Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Professor Roy Gardner. I'm the director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture of the spring semester. So as you know, this lecture series is made possible through the generous support of a great friend of Stetson, Bonnie Foreman. This is just one of the many ways that Bonnie contributes to and enriches the Stetson community, and we really appreciate all she does. So if you could please join me in thanking Bonnie for this. So at our last lecture, we heard from Vivek Menon about the Asian elephant. Today, we're going to be talking about a species a little closer to home, the manatee, an iconic Florida species, the state marine mammal, which is actually a distant relative to the elephant. So see, it all fits together. It's seamless. And it's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Harvey Holbrook. Her bio notes that she was born in Tampa, but then spent much of her childhood away. But she always had a love of manatees in her blood. And so, for example, she convinced her third grade class in Germany to adopt a manatee as their mascot and organized a bake sale to raise the necessary funds. What's the German word for manatee? So what is it in Russian? Because you know Russian as well, right?
I do, but they don't have a word for. Oh, and my mic is on.
Oh,
Hi.
So, I'm sorry. I'll continue with the introduction. So, after obtaining degrees in marine science and sustainability issues from the University of South Carolina Honors College, Anne received her JD from Georgetown Law. After law school, she worked as an attorney with Earth Justice on matters such as offshore oil drilling and the protection of springs. She returned to school for a master's in aquatic environmental sciences at FSU, where she also served as a postdoc teaching fellow. She joined the Save the Manatee Club as its staff attorney in 2015 and now focuses full-time on the protection of manatees and their habitat. Please welcome Harvey Holbrook.
Thank you all. If you have questions, I'll definitely have a Q&A at the end, but if there's something that crops up in the middle of the presentation, feel free to ask. I do have some teaching experience, but I've never been mic'd before, so we'll see how this goes. I'm going to start out with a little bit of the projects that our Conservation and Science Department works on. As a staff attorney, I am part of the Conservation Department, and so my duties actually occasionally filter into, well, heavily in the policy world and also sometimes in outreach and education, grant development, things like that. So it's been a really good position for me to be able to develop a lot of additional skills to being an attorney. And I know some of you have to leave early, so I want to say this in advance. We are hiring interns for the summer as well as for next fall through spring. So Erin has my contact information, but it's also available online. It's just aholbrook@savethemanatee.org. So send me a writing sample and resume, and we'll see what we can do. Okay. Save the Manatee Club was founded over 30 years ago by Jimmy Buffett and former U.S. Senator and Governor Bob Graham. This is a little bit outdated. We've actually grown a little bit, but we have over 11,000 members and supporters throughout Florida and an additional 33,000 nationally. I know a lot of you, well, you're all lawyers in here, right? So the reason that's important for us is because that's what gives us standing throughout the state of Florida. Everyone who adopts a manatee, everyone who invests in our organization's work and goes out regularly to observe and enjoy manatees, they give us standing in case we do end up bringing lawsuits. A brief history of manatee conservation. Manatees were among the first species ever listed to be protected under the early iterations of the Endangered Species Act. So on the very first list, manatee populations had dwindled down from hunting, from boats, from development, to just really dramatically low levels to the point where people just didn't see them ever. And they were listed. And then Jacques Cousteau did his famous presentation, or his famous documentary, The Forgotten Mermaids, which really drew international attention to the issue of manatee conservation. Manatees continued to be listed. The subspecies of the Antillean manatee joined the Florida manatee on the Endangered Species Act list. Save the Manatee Club was founded in 1981. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the primary agency charged with the care and conservation of the manatee, has drafted various recovery plans. You'll see the most recent one is in 2001. Make a note of that deadline because that's going to be something I gripe about later. We have a lot of statutes available to us as attorneys to protect manatees. There's the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, which is the one that we use on a most daily basis because it derives its authority from the Federal Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There's also the International Convention on, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. I don't work with that one very much, but we do work in Belize and in various countries throughout Africa and Australia on other Sirenian conservation work. And then, of course, actually one of the ones that I use most regularly is the Clean Water Act. With my background, I just end up doing a lot of water quality and water quantity work since my degree is in aquatic environmental science. And the Clean Water Act is where the state derives the majority of its authority to regulate water quality in springs, surface waters. Groundwater and flow are a different regime that are governed exclusively by state law. But obviously the Clean Water Act protecting springs is essential to protecting manatees, so I use that a lot. Our Science and Conservation Department breaks down roughly, our work can be broken down roughly into 3 categories: education and outreach, and the bold-faced topics are ones that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail. We have several, when I first started, an intern and I developed an online course called the Florida Springs Modules, which if you ever have a group like your local Sierra Club or something that you want to do a presentation for, that's actually a 7-part series of modules on springs, and that resource is available free to everyone's use on our website. We also designed the Blue Spring Adventures program, where we brought students from an underserved community into Blue Spring to do a dip and learn program where they did trawls and samples of the aquatic flora and fauna in the Blue Spring, and of course saw the manatees and got to learn about them. We also have adoptions available on our website. You guys probably know, living in Florida, all know that. It makes a great Christmas gift or Mother's Day gift. And then resource and tabling events. More of my work is focused on direct species protection. My boss works directly with the agency on developing rescue plans, monitoring and recovery plans. The agency, of course, because we may be having pending litigation in the near future, doesn't work directly with me because they're a represented party. So they have to have counsel present if I'm present. My bulk of my work on direct conservation of the species is on downlisting, and I know a lot of you guys are actually working on a downlisting project, so I might quiz you on that a little bit later. My day-to-day work typically focuses on habitat protection and advocacy. Like I said earlier, I do a lot of water quality and water quantity work. Right now, it means I'm following the legislature to make sure they don't do anything disastrous. And I also focus on the development of the Basin Management Action Plans, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about to manage nutrients in Florida's springs and surface waters. I've worked on the swim plans, which are just how the water management districts plan to allocate their resources for springs management. TMDLs, which are total maximum daily loads. They set pollution loads for impaired waters from point sources, pollution control and development plans. And so I just do a little bit of work in all of this. You know, if a developer is coming in and they're applying for an environmental resource permit, I look through the permit application to make sure that it's not going to pose any additional harm to water quality, and from that to manatees. And I will submit comments either to the Corps under the 404 permitting program or to the state under the environmental resource permitting program, saying these are the conditions that they need to abide by in order to safely conduct this project, and also these are tweaks we would like to see to the project to make it more compliant with both the letter of the law in a lot of cases and certainly with the intent of the law. Water quantity issues. Right now I'm primarily focused on the springs MFLs. Those are minimum flows and levels. The state is required to set minimum flows for all of its springs. Actually, I have a full slide on that, so I won't go into it now. And then CUPs, those are consumptive use permits. Anytime anybody wants to withdraw water, especially in large quantities, they have to apply for a consumptive use permit through the Water Management District. And then I frequently comment on direct development that occurs in manatee habitat, marina development, especially if it's in a manatee zone, port expansions, the Miami Boat Show, and any channel expansions that happen. You know, as the Panama Canal has been expanded, a lot of ports along the southeast are racing to dredge deeper and wider ports to accommodate these larger vessels. So we've had a rash of port expansions lately that we've been working on just over the past couple of years. This is just a picture from the Blue Spring Adventures program. It was just something I don't normally get to do, but it was really rewarding for me. You know, taking these kids, the majority of them are on the like the school lunch program where they have the assisted lunches, and they just don't really get to do stuff like this. And so we took them all out to the spring. It was funded by the Protect Florida Springs Grant Foundation, which is funded by your license plates if you have a manatee license plate. So that was a really cool experience. They had a great time. They did a little workshop before they went out, and then they did worksheets afterward, just telling us what they learned about the springs and the natural environment. And then they all got passes to come back with their families, or actually to go back to any Florida State Park with their families. As a lawyer, that's really fun for me because I protect all of this, but I don't get to go out and enjoy it nearly as much as I would like to. Everybody else gets the field jobs. Like, we have a guy who's out in the kayak every day counting manatees, and I'm sitting at the laptop, so that was fun. BMAPs, Basin Management Action Plans, that's a state of Florida program that it implements the water quality criteria program under the Clean Water Act. So it's part of the Federal Clean Water Act. It's a part that the state has been approved to administer, and BMAPs specifically are to measure nutrients. And they've been around for a while, but in the most recent, or in 2016, sorry, the Springs legislation that you probably heard talked about required the state and required the water management districts to develop basin management action plans for all the outstanding Florida springs. So this has been a process that we've been working with them on a lot recently, trying to develop priority focus areas in the spring where the spring shed is most vulnerable, looking at whether it's most vulnerable. Some areas of the state, like the Swanee River Water Management District, is heavily agriculturally dominated. So we've been working with the agricultural producers and with the state to try and get more data, because that's actually, the agencies have some trouble talking to each other, and everybody gets a little territorial. So that's been a problem, figuring out just how much nutrients is going into the water. And then we've been trying to get more advanced BMPs, which are tools that agricultural producers can use to reduce their input into the water. Now, if you're familiar with the Clean Water Act, you know that actually a lot of ag is really difficult to regulate because it's considered not a point source. And the Clean Water Act only directly regulates point source pollution. So agriculture is a huge thing that we need to get a handle on, especially in terms of nutrients. So it's been really interesting and challenging for all the parties involved. And so, you know, if any of you are familiar with ag and want to give me some ideas about ways they can reduce their nutrient pollution, I would love to hear them. Okay. And then we've got other areas like the Volusia Blue Spring, where the majority of the nutrients actually enter the waterway from on-site sewage and treatment disposal systems, OSTDS, septic tanks, basically. And that poses an interesting problem from an environmental justice standpoint, because there are septic systems that can provide advanced treatment that remove a lot of the nutrients from the waterways. But how do you require people to do that? So the municipalities are probably the way to go. Hooking places up to sewer where that's feasible, that's the best option. In some places, it really is very rural, and it's not really feasible or efficient to run a sewer line all the way out there. So you want them to install these more advanced septic systems, but at the same time, who pays for that? Is it going to be the municipality? Is it going to be the homeowner? Is that a fair thing to ask a homeowner to do, to mortgage their house for a $20,000 septic system upgrade, you know, when they may have been in that house for a couple of generations and it's all paid off? So it's a challenge and something that the states are dealing with. But we would very much like to see improvements to the septic systems. In Volusia Blue is the primary area that we're targeting, and the state has money available to do this. So we're just trying to get them to commit those resources and to develop a clear management plan for how they want to get these septic systems off to remove the nutrients that are going into that critical system. Wakulla, I live in Tallahassee, so Wakulla is the spring nearest to my heart, and that is further along in the process, and actually they're just working now on that OSTDS remediation plan. So they are working on getting people off of septic onto sewer below the area where the Cody Scarp is what it's called up in Tallahassee, where the geologic feature makes the groundwater most vulnerable. So that's the area that they're primarily focused on. And they're bringing a lot of stakeholders to the table, including a lot of the FSU scientists. So that's been very educational and interesting for me. And then all along the Springs Coast, just north of here, I spend a lot of time in Brooksville lately, having meetings on the Springs Coast BMAPs. Weekiwachi, Homosassa are in progress right now. Wakaiva, Crystal River was done a while ago. So all of those are available on DEP's website, but they're really difficult to navigate. So it's a really interesting process to learn about, and they are on a tight deadline. Well, actually, they're all supposed to be done by, I think, July, but I might be confusing that with the MFLs. The MFLs had to be done by July of last year. So anyway, I think maybe the BMAPs also have to be done by July of this year. But I'm following that process, and so that's my day-to-day work. Also the MFLs, which are minimum flows and levels, and the state is going through the process of setting minimum flows and levels for all the outstanding Florida springs. Two in particular that we're concerned about are naturally the Crystal River Kings Bay MFL. It's so important to the manatees. And they're allowing 11% additional withdrawal before they reach what they consider the significant harm threshold. Significant harm has been defined in an interesting way with regard to MFLs, because somewhere along the line, when they were doing an MFL for the Peace River, I think it was, they determined at DEP that significant harm constituted or was constituted by a 15% reduction in the resource value. So whatever the resource value is, whether that's water for public use or fishing or manatee habitat, they can lose 15% of that value off the top. That is what constitutes significant harm. And from that assumption, they backtrack and figure out how much water can we take out so that we're only losing 15% of the resource. This has some pretty obvious problems. First of all, where does that assumption come from? Second, how do you determine which resource is the most valuable resource that you're looking at? If you're losing 15% of the manatee habitat, or if you're losing 15% of the consumptive water, those are going to be different values. And really, it's the additive of, the cumulative and aesthetic value of the resource as a whole that they should be looking at. So that's another assumption that goes into it that's problematic. And these things are really difficult to challenge because the agency receives a lot of deference. This assumption just has been, this 15% marker has been used for a couple of decades, and so it's past the point of being able to challenge that, and through use, it's become accepted, and now the agency receives deference on it, and there have ended up being a few peer-reviewed articles that support it. So it makes it really difficult to challenge everything that comes from that initial assumption. But another problem with it, and this is even more pronounced in the Rainbow River, where I think they're only allowing a 5% reduction from current flow, maybe. But the way they define what is significant, in addition to just this 15%, comes from a long-term averaging period. So this is kind of complicated to explain, but basically the way that they will determine whether the spring and the spring run have dropped below their minimum levels is by taking the data and averaging it back. For Rainbow, I think it's back like 50 or 60 years. And so you can see how when you throw all of that data of a strong past flow in with new data from a low flow, it all kind of evens out and it comes out in the middle and averages to a level above the proposed minimum flow level. So there's some difficulty there in determining when it actually is going to drop below minimum flow. And this is all done on purpose because there really is no recourse if it drops below the minimum flow. They have to come up with what's called a remediation plan, but there have been places in the legislative history where they have said, we do not want to trigger a point at which we can no longer issue consumptive use permits. Those are the CUPs I mentioned earlier that everybody has to withdraw, everybody has to apply for in order to withdraw water. So, and you can see why, they would have disincentives to disallowing those permits. But at some point, our argument is the spring is going to collapse if you continue allowing people to withdraw as much as they want all the time. You have to find a way to encourage people to conserve water or to use less or not have development in that spring shed if that's what it comes to. So it's a really problematic process. In the case of Crystal River, there's not nearly enough sampling going on. There's some 70 springs as part of that system, if not more, and only a few of them are sampled. So it makes it really, really difficult to get a handle not only on what's happening and what they're measuring, but at what point you're dropping below the MFL and what happens then. You put in a remediation plan, but it has no teeth. So it's really challenging. And downlisting, I know a lot of you are actually familiar. Who's in the Research and Writing 2 class that's working on downlisting? Okay, so you guys have already addressed standing, which I actually don't even discuss in my lecture because I just kind of assume we have standing. We're the Manatee people. But the background of this case is that the federal government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, did a status review, I think in 2007, that said manatees may be recovered to the point of warranting reclassification from endangered to threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Then they took no further action on it, primarily because a couple of things happened. We had a couple of really bad years for manatees. Record die-offs from cold stress, red tide, the unexplained mortality event in the Indian River Lagoon. If you guys are long-term Floridians, you may remember these events. It was not looking good for manatees. Well, there's an organization, actually I think they may be based here in St. Pete, called the Pacific Legal Foundation, whose, I don't want to sound biased, so I'm trying to find a way. They would consider themselves a pro-liberty organization, I think, and I consider them an anti-regulation, anti-environmental organization. So that's two sides of the same coin, I guess, depending on your view. They threatened to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service for not downlisting the manatee. So Fish and Wildlife then had to spend a lot of resources going through a 12-month finding in response to that. That's mandated by the statute, mandated by the Endangered Species Act. So then they went through the process of determining whether or not the manatee was justified to be reclassified. And actually, this was during the final years of the Obama administration, which reclassified, downlisted, or delisted more species than any prior administration. And so manatees seem to be sort of swept up in that. And a lot of the scientists, a lot of the peer-reviewed scientists that they're required to receive input from in making this reclassification process said, it's too early, we can't tell if manatees are recovered yet. And then, you know, of course, the lawyers got our hands on it, and we're like, you're not even following the law. How can you be doing this? So the final rule was nevertheless published in April of last year, and they went ahead and proceeded with downlisting. The service says, you know, we want to get back to focusing on the animal. We've wasted all this time responding to PLF's threat of a lawsuit. We actually want to now work on species recovery, and if we have to respond to another lawsuit, that'll be more time that it takes to actually work on a new recovery plan, since they haven't done one since 2001, or a new stock assessment, or gather any more data about the health of the species, because they are a small office. My counter argument to that is, I haven't seen you doing anything. So we'll see what happens. But this case is set up. A lot of you know about the law already, so you know, feel free to chime in, or I'm always looking for creative additions too. Also, footnote, for those of you that don't think you would have something to add to an experienced lawyer, one, I'm not that experienced, and two, my very first case ever, I actually did really poorly in evidence. It was my only class that I didn't do well in law school, and so it really, I wasn't confident in that. And the very first case I worked on, we had trouble getting something into evidence. And I said something about, oh, what about the antiquities rule? And the judge was like, you need to give her a raise because she just got your evidence in. And people who had been litigating for like 40 years hadn't thought of this rule. Sometimes a fresh insight, you know, because you've been learning something from the book, or because you're not in habit mode, like a lot of experienced litigators might be. So never think that you don't have something to add just because that you're younger and experienced. Okay, that's my tangent. So feel free to tell me if you come up with an idea that I can use. Generally speaking, the language of the statute on its face says that endangered means any species in which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So then we get to parse out, what does it mean to be in danger of extinction? And I think I must have it on the next slide, but the Fish and Wildlife Service has determined through a very informal process that they call the polar bear memo, that in danger of extinction means on the brink of extinction, that it'll be gone within 100 years or so. So if you've been following manatees, you know that there are about 6,000, although the past 2 years have actually seen a decrease in their numbers. But it had been a pretty consistent upward trajectory. So models were indicating, you know, the manatee is not on the brink of extinction. You know, unfortunately for the service, that is not the law for whether or not you can reclassify an animal, I would argue. And this polar bear memo has never been subject to public notice and comment. So as a rule, it's on shaky legal ground. The other portion is, they say endangered means any species which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. The significant portion of range rule also comes under fire. Now they did go through notice and comment with this one, sneaky. In the original notice of proposed rulemaking interpreting significant portion of range, the Fish and Wildlife Service said that an animal is in danger in a significant portion of range, you know, more or less what you would think if that portion of the range is in fact significant. If without it, the species would decline. Well, they reversed the position and they reversed the interpretation of that statement in their final rule. So people had commented on one version of the rule, and then they completely reversed it when they issued the final rule. Now, they interpret the significant portion of range to mean that without that portion of the range, the animal would cease to exist. So for the manatee, though in 84% of the countries in which the manatee is found, it's found throughout the wider Caribbean, the Antillean manatee is, for 84% of the area in which it is found, it is declining or unknown. Its status is declining or unknown. But because its status is considered stable in Florida, it is not in danger of extinction in a significant portion of its range, because even if all manatees in the world outside of Florida were to wink out of existence, the Florida manatee would still survive, or the West Indian manatee would still survive, which the West Indian manatee is the umbrella species for the subspecies Florida and Antillean manatee. So that's how they've interpreted it. The Florida Peninsula is the only area of the manatee's range that is considered significant for the purposes of the Endangered Species Act, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service. That rule has been challenged as applied in a couple of cases where conservationists have won. Nothing that is binding on our jurisdiction so far, but it's persuasive and it certainly looks good for us because they've managed to just completely remove the meaning of the words from the rule. Okay, I think I've covered all that. Oh, and best scientific and commercial data. Part of our argument is that that's one of the requirements of the rule, and it's not based on the best scientifically and commercially available data. One of the major issues legally that I've been looking at, and that you'll all be looking at in your memos, I hope, is this 5-factor test. In order to list or delist a species, a species shall be listed or reclassified if the agency determines, on the basis of the best scientific and commercial data available, that the species is endangered or threatened because of one or a combination of the following factors. Those factors are the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat and range. That's a big one in Florida, especially with what I was telling you about the MFLs. Right? We don't know what's going to happen with the future of Florida springs. Over 1,000 people a day move to Florida. It's the 3rd largest state in the country, and this development, now that the recession is essentially over, it is increasing again. A lot of those people are moving to coastal areas. I have a map here in a few minutes that will show you where that development looks likely to be. It is by no means a guarantee that threats to manatee habitat are controlled, and that is the legal standard that's required for downlisting. So this doesn't even begin to consider climate change and saltwater intrusion and issues like that, which are not really modeled in a lot of what the data that the service relied upon, and that can't be known, let alone controlled. So overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes, this is primarily an issue for the Antillean manatee, although we occasionally have some of those issues crop up in the Crystal River area. Disease or predation, the population here is actually pretty healthy, but again, that can be a problem for the Antillean manatee. The inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. This one I feel could be potentially really important depending on what the legislature does now and in future sessions. If there are any changes made to the Manatee Sanctuary Act, which there have been efforts to have that act undermined, or local speed zone removals, that removes these protections and these existing regulatory mechanisms. And so since you can't know what's going to happen with these existing regulatory mechanisms, it seems disingenuous to me to state that these threats are controlled. And then this blanket factor as well, other natural or man-made factors affecting its continued existence. That actually includes boat strikes, which are on the rise again. 2016 and 2017 were record years for boat strikes, tied at 106 manatees known to have been killed from boat strikes. And that doesn't include all the manatees that were decomposed to make a determination for. This is just a slide on threats to habitat. That's a fish kill on the Indian River. Harmful algal blooms are another major factor that threaten the manatee and its habitat. So the depletion of oxygen that occurs during these fish kill, or during eutrophic events and harmful algal bloom events. And there's the development map that I showed you from FWC's Wildlife 2060 projections. This is just to illustrate the loss of the springs. If you're not familiar with the Springs Eternal project, it's really moving and really sad. John Moran has gone back through time and culled a bunch of these older pictures of springs, and he compares them with photos now. His Springs Eternal project is based in High Springs, so he focuses a lot on that Swanee River area. But you can see White Springs there. It used to be this major public bathhouse where people would come from all over. And if you've heard stories about Florida in the 50s, and 60s, you know that the springs were the major draw. And, all these vintage postcards are like people hanging out at the springs. And now we still think the springs are pretty because we have a shifting baseline problem. We never experienced them in the 50s and 60s, and probably even then, according to data from USGS, which is the primary agency responsible for monitoring springs and geologic features in Florida, even in the 50s and 60s, that wasn't their natural state. So that brings up another problem with the MFLs when we're considering what are we measuring this back against? If we can decline it, if we can allow a reduction in 11% of the flow from baseline levels, where are we setting baseline levels? Are we setting them in the 50s? Are we setting them at the present day? Are we setting them at the earliest recorded measures that we have? These are uncontrolled direct threats to manatees. This is a manatee called Red Hot Poker. If you can see, someone's actually written their name on this little guy. But also he has a lot of boat strikes, and so that's just me trying to underscore the point that boat strikes have been on the rise again. And what we actually find is most boaters don't want to hit a manatee. Most people love me. I like to go out on the boat, and I would be devastated if I hit a manatee. So, speed zones and everything do tend to have a lot of, the boating community in general seems to me to be very receptive to these boating restrictions and speed zone restrictions in areas where manatees are known to be present. And there are a lot of things you can do, and Save the Manatee Club works very hard at promoting the awareness for boaters of what you can do, where the speed zones are, how to wear polarized sunglasses, make sure you've got a spotter, how to recognize a manatee footprint on the water. That's that water that looks like it's boiling. We call it a footprint, but it's their peduncle swishing against the top of the water. And I'll get to that later, I guess. And of course, we've got the national level where all of our environmental protections are currently under assault on what feels to me, trying to monitor them like a daily basis. The president just released his budget proposal for the fiscal year 2019, which just cuts NOAA by I think almost $1 billion, cuts EPA by 25%, cuts Fish and Wildlife, I think, by 20%, including almost eliminating funding for new species listings, and cuts USGS as well, and just dramatic cuts. And most of those will not be enacted because actually the Endangered Species Act and most of our environmental acts enjoy broad popularity with the American public, and Congress isn't going to make deep cuts to them. But what we are encountering are regular attacks on the Endangered Species Act by certain members of Congress. The Representative Gates or Gatz, or however his name is pronounced in the Panhandle, is one of the worst offenders on that. And Congress is just meeting now to finalize their budget and appropriations by March 23rd, and you're getting a lot of, we're seeing a lot of anti-environmental and anti-ESA riders on there. So most of the ESA riders are targeted at specific species and won't affect manatees, but they set bad precedent. And the species are supposed to be determined, listing determinations are supposed to be made on the basis of scientific evidence, not political interest. And so for Congress to go and overrule Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA on these determinations is just beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. And to do it in an utterly non-transparent way through budget appropriations writers, I think is just dishonest and doesn't allow the American public to be involved in these decisions. So we're working on trying to get them to pass a clean appropriations bill with none of these insidious riders on it. You probably also, and one of the President's budget proposals is to completely eliminate the Marine Mammal Commission. So the commission that makes the scientific determinations for manatees, depleted stocks of other marine mammals, dolphins, whales, gone if the president has his way. But again, I don't think Congress is going to let that one quite fly. Offshore oil drilling poses an interesting case because of the tweets that happened where Rick Scott was like, no, you can't drill in Florida, and Zinke was like, okay, we won't. That actually creates an interesting dilemma now if they exclude Florida from their offshore leasing program because it's arbitrary and capricious. They haven't made a scientific determination for why they want to do that. It's very transparently a political decision now. That actually puts Florida more in danger of offshore drilling than it would have been if these politicians would have just laid low a little bit. One of the other things that I'm following currently in the legislature is there's a fast-track proposal for the state to assume the federal dredge and fill permitting program from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Right now, their Army Corps is sort of a backstop. That 404 permitting is a kind of a backstop to the DEP's environmental resource permitting program, and what they want to do is unite the two permitting programs. DEP actually has a mandatory timeline for responding to those that the Corps does not have, so the effect will be that DEP rushes them through. Also, DEP is much less likely to tell a developer no for lots of industry capture reasons than the Corps is, because the Corps, having their bosses in DC, makes them somewhat isolated from some of those political pressures from local development. So unfortunately, that looks like it's definitely going to pass. But if you want to follow that issue, sign up for our action alerts, because that's what I've been primarily working on for the last couple weeks, and I'm just having no luck. So, but we'll see. I think the place to stop that might be in EPA's approval of that process in the court, because EPA is definitely going to approve it. So, bright spots. We almost got a fracking ban in Florida again this year. It's probably not going to happen, but we got closer than we ever have before, so that's exciting. A year ago, I was heavily involved in the EPA's approval, the state development of toxic water quality criteria, mainly from pulp and paper and those types of industries, where the state was revising upward the amount of these toxins that they were going to allow in the water. Bad news for animals, bad news for subsistence fishermen, kind of bad news all around. So out of nowhere, we had pretty much lost that one, and then the state just decided to pull those criteria. So we're still not exactly sure what happened, but you know, I'll take it. Okay, what we would like to see moving forward to see the manatees recover and sort of for the service to put its money where its mouth is we need some additional springs protection, whether those come from the state or the federal government. They need to be meaningful, not just lip service, and they need to not try and obscure the fact that, I mean, anyone living on these springs or who frequently comes in contact with them can tell you, you know, they have reduced spring flows and reduced water quality. They're icky in a lot of places on a lot of days. And that needs to be addressed in order for manatee survival, in order for Floridians to enjoy our natural heritage that we have a right to. So that's what we would want to see the service get involved in, perhaps establishing additional refuge areas for manatees to give their populations a place to grow, as in particular some of these coal plants shut down. The Trump administration has pulled several of the rules that would have resulted in shuttering coal plants more immediately, but the fact of the matter is that coal is not that economically viable anymore relative to natural gas and renewables. So a lot of coal plants are going to shut down anyway. We lose that warm water effluent. Over time, a lot of manatees have come to rely on that warm water effluent as springs have dried up. So as those plants shutter, the manatees are going to need somewhere else to go. If springs continue to dry up or get clogged with boats or clogged with development, they really won't have anywhere. So it may be necessary for Fish and Wildlife to develop or to establish additional refuges. One of the other things we would like to see, my number one personally, is the removal of the Rodman Dam. That has been agreed to by every party except the bass fishermen, but it has been legally adjudicated as something that needs to be done. And the National Fish and Wildlife have agreed to it, the legislature has agreed to it, everybody has pretty much come to the table and said this needs to be done, and yet nothing is happening. So that dam's over 20 springs that flow into the St. Johns River system that manatees have historically used. So that would be one small step for humans, but one big step for manatee conservation, I guess. I don't know. Didn't think that one through in advance. But anyway, I'd like to see that. And then one of the things we're also working on promoting is more boater reporting of manatee collisions, because we want to make a distinction between incidents and accidents. Because most boaters, if they do hit a manatee, they didn't mean to do it. So if they report that right away to FWC, there's a chance we can rescue that manatee and rehabilitate it. Even if we can't, there is a better chance that we can at least get better data on how many manatees are being struck by boats in a particular area in case we do need a new speed zone. Or if we think we have higher reporting, we know that if there's an area where there's not a lot of reporting and a lot of manatees are still washing up dead, there must be something else going on. So just that increase in data would be helpful, let alone helping the individual manatees. So we're trying to work with the state and with boating community to figure out what we can do to increase reporting on that. Yes? Hashtag FWC. There's actually an app now too, and we have all of that information on our website too, but there's actually an app where you can report it to FWC directly. And they coordinate the state efforts to, if you see one too, like even if you don't hit it, but you encounter one, you're like, I think there's a wounded manatee or a dead manatee, star FWC, hashtag FWC, everything else. Yes? Right.
Thank you. Of the manatee, but if you could be queen for a day, what big initiative would you like to see that could make a substantial impact on the protection of manatees?
So if I were queen for a day, I might actually punt that question to my boss, who so I'm the legal expert and I do most of the policy work, but she has her PhD in manatee veterinary science. So with regard to manatees, she is the expert. My degree is in like microbiology and nutrient chemistry and everything. But from my perspective as a nutrient management scientist, I would like to see actual meaningful regulation of nutrients, not just from point sources, but from non-point sources as well. That would be my queen for the day ask, is actual pollution controls on nitrogen and phosphorus, especially nitrogen. So, good question. Other questions? I'm on the question portion now.
So I know some of you may need to leave, but for a 1 o'clock class, but I encourage you all to stay. And so before any of you depart, if you could please join me in thanking Ann for a wonderful presentation. So, questions?
I was wondering, I'm on the water all the time, paddleboarding, and I see people constantly taking their watercraft with, man-made propulsion systems into areas that are restricted, where I guess manatee mating and other activities. But I never know who to call. I grab my phone, I'm like, who do I call? Like,
Yeah.
Is there a specific state law enforcement agency or something you could call so they can get a boat over there and ticket them or whatever?
You can report that, I think, using the same app, using the same call, because that goes to FWC directly, and they then, I think, have a switchboard. Actually, I haven't made the call, but I think they have a switchboard that'll move you around. And the enforcement, I should have included this. Enforcement is a really big problem. The state just doesn't have the budget for constant enforcement the way they have for highway patrolmen. But that's the biggest issue, really, is, you know, if somebody is breaking the law, we don't really have any way to catch them. It just kind of happens to be luck a lot of the time. But you can report them to FWC, especially if you get a plate. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that we were hoping to have were something like a speeding camera, the way that a lot of municipalities have red light cameras. But because FWC doesn't have the resources to monitor those cameras directly all the time, and a Florida court has ruled it unconstitutional invasion of privacy for them to contract that out, it actually makes it not a feasible solution, even though technologically speaking it might be the best one. And that's a question that we get all the time, is why don't you have speed cameras? That's why, if any of you wants to put your legal mind to work on that, and come, I just haven't gotten around to it. It's on my very long to-do. I'm the only attorney in our office, by the way, so it's a very long to-do list, but I welcome insight onto that.
You made a comment about you always presume that you have standing. How do you get around the imminent harm element?
I'm sorry?
The imminent harm element of standing. What is your imminence from the downgrade threshold? You kind of just brushed it off, and we spent a lot of time like arguing that point. So I was curious as to what your opinion was.
Because we have potentially pending litigation, I can't go into that in too much detail right now, mainly because of like an observation of fact, me saying something could create conditions that are unfavorable to our case. If you come work for me and sign a non-disclosure agreement, I will answer that more fully.
Probably could have just talked, we're pretty close here. But you mentioned working with agricultural producers along the Suwannee River to try to gather data. I'm wondering if you ran into more reception or more resistance when you were working with those folks, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, you know, some of our partner organizations have actually had a lot of receptivity from the agricultural community. And this is not, our partners have been more heavily involved in this aspect of it than I am, but I think the real holdup is that that data is collected by one agency and not shared with another. So that is a real barrier to policy, and I'm not, you know, a lot of it is considered confidential business information. For example, you know, how much fertilizer is applied on a certain farm is collected by DACS, but they don't want to share it with DEP. You know, and at some point, you know, somebody from the agent, you ask the agencies that, and they're like, oh, we share things, and it's like, well, then why isn't this, you know, they say this data is a gap in the BMAP process. So why is that if you do share? So that's where I think the breakdown occurs, but I've never worked for either agency, so I can't confirm that.
Other questions? Well, let me ask one final question, sort of a two-part question. So to what extent do you use administrative law in your practice, and what advice do you have here for the students who may want to go into the environmental area? What should they be doing now to prepare themselves for the future?
My answer to the second question, how often do I use administrative law? I consider most environmental law to fall within the umbrella of administrative law, so in that sense I would use it every day. How often do I use the state or federal APA? Anytime I'm considering litigation, basically, or, you know, especially with regard to NEPA, if I'm going to pursue a claim there. The second question for my advice, I find that school administrators don't like my answer to this question, but my answer is go for the nonprofit job. Don't just go for the easy job. Don't go for the job that pays. If I'm in a position to hire with an actual budget to hire another attorney, I'm not going to give it to somebody who worked for Hopping Green. I'm going to give it to somebody who had, a dedicated interest in environmental conservation, who I know is on my team. So I get pushback on that from professors and stuff sometimes, saying you're giving, I'm just trying to give you both sides, because I know that some people will say, like, well, you've got to pay your student loans, which is true, especially since the loan repayment program might not be around forever. But I really, if you want to work in conservation, don't tell yourself, like, oh, I can work for the bad guys and make a lot of money and donate to the organizations that I like. Like, you are actively working for people who make my life harder. And, they have such resources to pile on. But as far as what you can do in law school, everybody's different. Like, whatever, do what you're interested in, and that will tend to lead to something that you're good at, and something that you're successful in. But one of the things that I did is I sort of specialized very, very early. My 1L summer, I did exclusively Clean Air Act enforcement work and Clean Water Act work on coal. And it was a very niche area. I worked during the school year, which is typically, I think, frowned upon. I don't know if it still is, but it was then, instead of doing things like journal, which a lot of my friends did, and which I totally think is definitely worth doing. But I was just working all the time. So when the recession hit, Earth Justice was actually in the middle of their big coal campaign, and they were looking for a coal attorney and a fossil fuels attorney. They hired me. Granted, 2 days later, Deepwater Horizon blew, and I became an oil attorney and an oceans attorney. But and then from there, nutrients and just things come up. But if you find something that you enjoy, I don't know that I would put too much stress on yourself to branch out or to do other things or to make sure you get a full grounding in crim law if that's not what you're interested in. Sorry, administrators don't like that one.
And just for the record, we do encourage you to go work for conservation groups. So, so no worries there. We're entirely consistent. And if you could just close and turn on that point, if folks are interested in internships, where is the location, and again, how do they apply for that?
So because it's unpaid, I like to be flexible with my interns. I'm not going to require you to relocate to Tallahassee, which is where I am based. If you wanted to do something non-law related, you might need to be in the Maitland office, but I have my interns and I work together, and I am perfectly willing to work over Skype or Google Voice or chat or whatever. And most of the work is done by email anyway. So the number one thing that I look for is good writing. It's something I can teach, but it's time consuming for me to do so. So if you come in with good writing, that makes you a much stronger candidate as far as I'm concerned, because I can actually give you substantive work assignments. What I try to do with my interns is make sure that you and I both get something out of the program. And I can do externships as well if Stetson is okay with that. But I have no objection to internship, externship, whatever works for you. But I typically want you to get a really good writing sample out of it. You'll have a lot of independence, but I rely on my interns pretty heavily. So you don't have to come in with a strong base in the law, but you have to come in with strong writing skills, because I just don't have time to. I would foster that, and improve it, but that's the one thing I really, really look for. So if you want to apply, send me your resume, unofficial transcript, and a writing sample. It doesn't have to be a legal writing sample either, because so much of what I do is policy-based or comments, comment letters and things like that. So and there's my email up there. And also you can email me about anything. Erin can tell you that sometimes I'm hard to, it takes me a day or two to get back, depending on how busy I am. But I'm always happy to give advice, for whatever it's worth. I don't have all the answers. Everyone's career is different, but I'm happy to give my 2 cents. So feel free to email me anytime.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ann.